So today we're going to create a very simple logo animation, and we're going to do it in Photoshop. It's always nice to know what we're trying to create before we start to build it. So here's a preview. And you can see that this is a very simple animation. The logo fades in, a gleam effect passes over it, and then there's a reveal of the typography at the bottom of the logo. To begin, we'll launch Photoshop. And once Photoshop opens up, we're going to go to the File menu, and we're going to select New. From the presets along the top, we're going to choose Film and Video, and select NTSC DV. I'm selecting this size for no particular reason other than the canvas size is quite small, which frees up some of your screen real estate when we're working to create this animation. So I'm going to select NTSC DV, click Create, and a new file opens up. You should have some guides visible in your document, and these are our title safe, the innermost, and motion safe. Without getting mired in too many technical things, just know that you want to always respect this title safe area when you're creating something that's going to be presented on some sort of monitor or TV screen. Anything that absolutely has to be seen should reside within that title safe area. Think of it very similar to margins when you're working on a print document. I always find it's helpful if my workspace looks similar to the workspace in the video that I'm following. So we will go to the Window menu, and we will go to Workspace. If you don't have Essentials selected already, select it. And if Essentials is selected already, select Reset Essentials. And that will just ensure that all the palettes and the toolbar are in the exact same positions. And now I'm going to click and drag my Layers palette out and over to the middle of my document or beside my canvas area, just so that it's easier for me to work with, and it's closer to the center of the screen, so hopefully it's easier for you to look at. I'm going to create a new layer, and I want to fill this layer in with a purple color. You don't have to choose purple, but something kind of dark, but not too dark. I'm going to select my Paint Bucket tool, which of course shares a spot with the Gradient tool. So if you only see the Gradient tool here in your tool palette, you're going to click and hold to select Paint Bucket, or you might just see Paint Bucket by default. And now that we have the Paint Bucket selected, we can click on our foreground color chip and use our color picker to choose a color. I'm going to click OK, click, and now I've added that color to the layer. And I'm going to take a moment to rename my layer by double-clicking on the layer name and calling it Background Color. And press Enter to lock in that change to the name. Now we have our background in place. We're going to add our logo to our document. So we're going to go to File, and we're going to use one of the Place commands. I'm going to ask it to place embedded. Navigate to your desktop, open up the simple Gleam effect folder, and inside you should find something called alogo.ai, and we're going to click Place. We're going to accept the defaults, click OK, and you'll notice that it just pops it right into the center of the document, and we're just going to move it up a little and then press Enter to place. Now that we have our logo in position, we're going to create a new layer. So now we're going to create our gleam. We're going to return to the Paint Bucket, and we're going to click and hold and select the Gradient tool. And then we're going to click on this little preview of what that gradient looks like in order to edit it. And let's just start with the black and white gradient, and then we'll make some changes. The first change I'm going to make is I'm going to remove this black color chip. And then I'm going to move the white color chip into the middle. Now right now we don't really have a gradient because it's not shifting color or opacity. That's the next change we're going to make. I'm going to click above this little color ramp area, or the color preview area, to add a new stop so I can control the opacity. So in the middle of the gradient, I want it to be 100%. And on the edges, I'm going to change that to 0. And over here, do the same, 0. Now I have a gradient that gradually transitions to white and then transitions to transparent again. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to add that to that new layer that we created earlier. And I'm going to add it on an angle. And I'm going to click here and drag sort of towards the middle and release. And that looks pretty good. If you're not happy with the direction of your gradient or where it's positioned or how wide it is, just press Command-A to select all, press Delete, and try again. And let's take a moment to rename our layer so that we know what it is, and it's going to be our Gleam. And now what we want to do is we want to create a mask so we don't see the gleam going throughout the whole document. We want it to only apply to that logo area. So we're going to do a couple of things. We are going to, on the A logo layer, you're going to hold your Command key and click, and that loads that layer as a selection. And then we're going to click on the Gleam layer, and we're going to add a mask. We do that simply by clicking the Add Mask button at the bottom of the layer palette. And now I have a mask. Now ultimately what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to move the gleam but leave the mask exactly where it is. So I'm going to unlink these two elements so I can move them or not move them independent of one another. And you can already see how this simple gradient is creating this gleam effect. Now that we have our gleam in place, we can actually start to use some of the animation tools. So I'm going to reselect my Move tool, and then I'm going to go to the Window menu and select Timeline. And then I'm going to click Create Video Timeline. And I'm going to click on that little Name tab and pull it up and out so that I can resize that window so it's easier to see what's going on. And you can see that each layer, with the exception of the background layer, each layer in my layers palette is represented here in my timeline. So we'll start first. We won't worry about the gleam yet. We'll worry about a simple fade to bring in the logo to begin with. So I'm just going to hide that layer. And we're going to click on this little arrow next to the A logo name. And when you twirl this open, you can see these are the different things we can animate over time. So we're going to concentrate on opacity. So I'm going to click on this little stopwatch to enable that keyframe animation. And the moment I do that, wherever my current time indicator here is in my timeline window, it adds this little diamond shape, which is a keyframe. So right now, the opacity is at 100%, and I'm going to move my current time indicator further into my timeline. And we can always adjust this later, so it doesn't really matter how far or how close it is. And I'm going to click to add another keyframe. So right now I have two keyframes, and you can see there's no change because the opacity is 100% in both those keyframes. So I'm going to move my current time indicator back to the 0 point. I'm going to click on that keyframe, and over here in my layer palette, you can see that it knows that we're editing this A logo layer. I'm going to change my opacity to 0. And I should see that disappear, but then if I click my current time indicator and drag it through, scrubbing through the timeline, you can see that it gradually fades in. If ever I want that fade to be slower or faster, all I need to do is move this keyframe. If I move it closer, it'll fade in faster, and further away, it takes more time and fades in more gradually. We haven't saved anything yet, so that's probably a good idea. So let's go to File, Save, click on my desktop, double-click my Simple Gleam Effect folder, and I'm going to name this the way I encourage all my students to name files, which is my last name, my first initial, and a little piece of text that's descriptive of what the project is. So I'm just going to call this Gleam. And click Save. Scrubbing through the timeline like we've been doing so far is sort of nice, but we don't really know how quickly it's actually going to play back. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the play button. And you'll notice that as that play button moves along, it's creating this little green bar. It means it's building a little preview of your animation. Every time you make a change, it'll have to go through that process again. Luckily, this is quite simple, so we're not going to spend a lot of time waiting for previews to build. But the first time you press that play button and it's initially building that preview, you might not get a true sense of the speed of your animation. So you might have to let it roll through a couple of times until you can actually get a good sense of how briskly or not things are moving. Another thing I find helpful too is because I often want to watch something animate again and again so I can sort of decide, do I like it? Is it too fast? Is there a little glitch? And where is that glitch? We're going to click on this little gear button in the timeline window, and you want to select loop playback. And you might want to change your resolution to 100% if it's set to 50. If it's set to 50, it means that the little previews it builds will look kind of coarse and crude. With a resolution of 100%, you get a true idea of exactly what things look like. So I'm just going to click and let it play through. And I'm going to stop the preview. And I'm kind of not enjoying how it just sort of starts to show up and fade in immediately. So I'm going to reposition my keyframes so that there'll be a moment or two where there's nothing on screen, and then we're going to see the logo fade in. I'm going to return back to the beginning and let it build that preview again and let it roll by one more time. All right. Now that we have our fade in place, I'm going to position my current time indicator just after that logo completely fades in. And then here, now that I've finished with the logo animation, I'm going to twirl that closed, and I'm going to twirl open the Gleam. Now remember before we hid that Gleam layer, so we're going to unhide that now, make it visible by clicking on the eye icon in the layer palette. And we're going to be changing the position of the Gleam. Remember that we unlinked it from the mask, so the mask will stay in place, but the Gleam itself will animate. So I'm going to click on the position stopwatch for the Gleam, and notice that we get a keyframe. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that we don't see the Gleam right away. So I'm just going to click and drag and move that over so it's not visible at all. And then I'm going to move my current time indicator further down the timeline. And now at this point in time, I want to move that Gleam all the way over to the other side. There's a couple of ways I can do this, and I think the simplest way is to ensure that auto select, if it's enabled, is deselected. And that will allow me to just click and drag my Gleam over all the way to the other side of the logo. If I tried using that click and drag technique with auto select enabled, what would probably end up happening is I would be clicking on the background layer and background color layer and moving that instead of whatever happens to be on the selected layer in the layer palette. And now I'm going to click and drag, and indeed that Gleam is moving. So I'm just going to preview the whole animation so far and see how I feel about it. And just to give this logo a little more punch, I am going to return to the A logo layer, and I'm going to click and hold on the Options tab in the Layers palette and select Blending Options. And I'm going to add a bit of a bevel and emboss effect just to give that logo a bit of a three-dimensional appearance. I'm going to click OK, and now that I've made that change, I'm going to preview one more time. And I'm a lot happier with that. Somehow Adding that bevel and emboss just makes that gleam make a little more sense. It's been a while since we've saved this document. We've already saved it once, so we just have to press Command S or File Save. And now we're ready to do our logo type reveal. So I'm going to twirl closed in my timeline the Gleam layer, and we'll be creating a new type element. And I'm just going to, in my layer palette, click on that Gleam layer, so any new layer or the type layer that I'm about to create will be created on top. So I'm going to select my text tool, horizontal type tool. I'm going to set my alignment to centered and click roughly in the middle and just add some words. You can add your name here if you want. I just set a company name. In my example, I'm going to select my text, and I'm going to use my properties palette over here to change the color to just white. And I'm going to change my, well, maybe I won't change my typeface. I'm going to leave the typeface to what it is. You can choose whatever typeface you like, and maybe make it just a little smaller so it doesn't feel like it's competing with the logo quite so much. And it's relatively centered, certainly enough for what we're trying to accomplish today. So now we have a type layer, and you might notice that in your timeline that layer starts where the current time indicator was. So that means there's no reference to this until this point in time, and that's fine. But you'll also notice that Photoshop wants to create references in the timeline that are always the same length of time. So what we can do is we can just shorten this up by clicking and dragging on the end and moving it over to the left so it lines up with everything else. Now what we'll do is we'll add a layer mask to the company name layer. So to start, we'll select our rectangular marquee tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag so that little square sits entirely over the company name. And then I'm going to go to my layer menu, and I'm going to select layer mask, and I'm going to ask it to hide selection. And now that I have my layer mask, I'm going to unlink the mask from the type layer. So I'm going to twirl open a company name layer. I'm going to make sure my current time indicator is at the beginning of that company name clip. And notice that we have a special option for animating the layer mask position. Click on that stopwatch, and of course it will introduce a keyframe where my current time indicator was. And then I'm going to move further down in my timeline, and I'm going to click the keyframe button again to introduce a second keyframe. Then I'm going to reselect my move tool, and at this point in time I want to move that mask all the way out of the way. And now I'm going to scrub through and preview. And we're done. And at any time, of course, you can go back in, change the position and the timing of things, make things happen faster or slower, simply by adjusting the location of those keyframes. And now that we're done creating our animation, we want to render out a video file. We're going to move to a different area of the timeline window, this little option area, and we're going to simply select Render Video. And we can keep all of the default settings. It's going to create a video that's exactly the size of our original document. And of course, you could always change the size by altering these elements as well. And we click Render. I'm just going to hide Photoshop. And I ask my video to save to the desktop. And here it is. Boom, done.